Hey guys, are you ready for an unimaginable adventure where the dusty Wild West meets the mysteries of the soul? Tonight, turn off the lights, pull up a warm blanket, and let me tell you a story. Not about heroic cowboys or legendary gunfights. This is your story about a man who once had it all: the sweet scent of Kansas dawn, the laughter of his wife and child, until a shadow called the Crows stole everything, turning your life to ashes, your heart into a burning inferno. You wielded a hammer, a cold, heavy weapon, trekking across the desert with one purpose: revenge. You became a ghost, a terrifying legend, sowing fear among the wicked. But can a soul fueled only by rage ever find peace? In the wilderness, you met a mysterious mentor, a living spirit among rocks and wind, who taught you to tame the beast within, turning your anger into a compass. You found a flicker of light, a new drumbeat in your heart, until fate dealt a crushing blow, snatching away your only friend, plunging you into despair deeper than ever before. Can you still tell the difference between justice and brutality? Can you claw your way back from the abyss? And then, just when everything seemed lost, a woman with eyes that had weathered 100 storms appeared. She too had carried her own hammer, and she offered you a choice: succumb to the darkness or fight for something else, a life, a home. Your journey will culminate in a haunted ghost town where you'll confront the final enemy, the architect of your pain. Will it be a bloodbath or a liberation? Can you find your way home, or will you just be another lost soul carried on the desert wind? If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And please let me know where you're listening to this journey unfold from on this dusty map of the world. Now let's dive in. The world had just ended, and you hadn't even had the decency to die with it. You pushed yourself up from the scorched earth, your skull a bass drum beating a savage rhythm against a rising tide of pain. Every fiber of your body screamed in protest, each breath a serrated knife in your lungs. But worse than the pain was the silence. Not the quiet of a Kansas evening, but a vast, suffocating emptiness where the sounds of your family used to be. The wind, once a gentle sigh through your cornfields, now shrieked through the skeletal remains of your barn, a mournful lament for all that had been lost. For a fleeting, desperate second, you wished to simply close your eyes and let the fire take you, to just disappear, to join them. But you remained, a monument of suffering amidst the ruins. A gnawing guilt settled deep in your gut, not for failing them, but for the unforgivable audacity of still existing. Then, in the hollow of that void, a spark. A fire from hell, not of sadness, but of a boundless, unholy fury. It raged in your chest, a furnace stoked by the images of those you had lost, melting away the last remnants of the softness you had ever known. A few hours ago, your life was as simple as a country song, a tune you hummed to yourself while the sun rose over the rolling hills of Kansas. Your wife's laughter had been the sweetest melody, and your boy, a whirlwind of energy who always wanted to ride a horse, was a piece of you that you were proud to follow. The crows came not as a sudden lightning strike, but as a slow, deliberate stain on the horizon, a gang of horse thieves who rode with a purpose colder than any winter wind. Your last memory before the world went black was the desperate, pleading shriek of your wife
and the terrified whimper of your boy, an echo that would forever be etched into the ruins of your mind. When you woke, it was to the same bitter, choking smell of smoke that clung to your tongue, and the desolate silence of a place that had just been erased from the face of the earth. The grim tableau of your ruined home, now etched into your very soul, remained unchanged.
Your eyes, now hard as flint, scanned the wreckage for a purpose. You didn't reach for a rifle. A rifle was for a kind of violence that had rules. Instead, your gaze fell upon the sledgehammer, its head rusted, but its handle still smooth. As your calloused hand closed around the familiar wood, a flood of memories hit you with the force of a tidal wave. You remembered using this very tool to build the chicken coop for your boy, to drive fence posts into the rich earth, to forge a home out of nothing. But now, as its cold weight settled in your grip, it felt like a grim prophecy. You weren't a builder anymore. The weight in your hands was no longer the burden of labor, but the weight of an unholy oath, a dark premonition of destruction. You clutched it like a sacrament of vengeance, the roughness of the wood a perfect mirror for the raw, savage hatred now simmering in your veins. It wasn't just wood and iron, it was a bludgeon, a blunt extension of the brutality that was now your only language. With the sharp corner of the hammer's head, you carved a deep, jagged gash into the smooth wooden handle. The wood groaned under the pressure, a protest against this desecration, then another, for your wife and your son. The 3 marks were not a symbol of loss, but a promise, a silent vow, etched in wood and born of fire. With that done, you turned your back on the ruin of your life. There was nothing left to see, nothing left to feel but the cold, hard certainty of your new path. Behind you was not a home, but a grave, and you were no longer a man. You were a tombstone, a monument to the vengeance that would now define you. You weren't looking for justice. Justice, you realized with a grim finality, was a sweet lie told by the weak to make it through the day. You had seen the world's true face, a world that only understood the language of blood and fire. And you, a man who had just crawled out of hell, were ready to start talking. Your journey began not with a grand stride, but with a limp, a slow, agonizing shuffle away from everything you had ever loved. The desolate landscape mirrored the emptiness in your soul. Dry, cracked earth stretched to a horizon that offered no hope, only the promise of more dust. The sun, a vengeful eye in the sky, beat down on you, and the air shimmered with the heat, a cruel mockery of the fire that had consumed your home. The cacti, with their spiny arms raised to the heavens, stood as silent curses, witnesses to your transformation. Every step you took was a physical testament to your grief, a dull, throbbing pain that served as a constant reminder. But with every mile that passed, the pain in your body began to feel less sharp, replaced by a numbness that was far more terrifying. The wind, which once carried the scent of growing corn, now whispered mournful tales through the prickly, sun-bleached tumbleweeds. You were a ghost of hate, a shadow of the man you once were, and that was good enough for you.
You left your old name behind in the dirt and the ash. It was a name for a good man, for a life that was gone forever. You didn't have a new name, not yet, but as you moved, something was shifting in the wind, a rumor that was beginning to circulate. The first person you saw was a lone traveler on a rickety wagon who froze at the sight of you. He saw the hammer, the blood-soaked clothes, and the empty, burning madness in your eyes. He didn't speak. He just whipped his horse into a frenzy and rode away like a bat out of hell, his frightened silence a perfect start to your legend. Later, as you limped past an abandoned ranch, a tattered sheepdog looked up from its weary slumber. It barked once, a weak, tired sound, and then whimpered like a child, slinking back into the shadows of the barn. Even the animals, you thought, could sense the darkness growing inside you. Then came the bounty hunters, or at least you reckoned that's what they were. 3 men on horseback who saw you from a distance. They stopped, their hands resting on their holstered guns. They didn't come closer. They just watched you, a gaunt figure with a sledgehammer, until the sun dipped lower and you passed them by. You saw the same look in their eyes, a mix of confusion and pure primal fear. People say God has a plan for all of us, you thought, a sarcastic grin twisting your cracked lips. Maybe his plan for you was to turn you into a monster. If so, he must be a director with a strange sense of humor. You no longer felt the burn of hunger or the rasp of thirst. The fire in your chest was all the sustenance you needed. It was your blood, your fuel, your very life. You were a walking dead man, existing only to settle a score with the living. Your journey was a long, bloody, and lonely road, with nothing but a hammer in your hand and a purpose that was forged in the fire of your broken past. This story, you knew, wasn't going to have a happy ending. It was going to have a furious one.
Blackwood Gulch wasn't a place for the faint of heart. The dust here didn't just cling to your clothes, it worked its way into your soul, thick and shameless. The air hung heavy with the cloying scent of cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and the faint coppery smell of old blood. Rickety signs for saloons and barber shops creaked and groaned in the hot wind, telling stories of broken dreams and silent deaths. Here, people didn't live. They just existed, waiting for something, good or bad, to come along and give them a show. And today, the main event was you. A pipsqueak of a man named Silas, all twitchy nerves and a shiny new 6-shooter, had a pistol pointed at your chest. He was a low-down horse thief, the kind who'd steal a man's lunch and then get a case of the vapors. He had a gun, a cold piece of steel with a story to tell. You had a fist. A calloused, scarred-up brick of a hand, a relic from a life you'd long buried. The crowd thought this was the funniest damn thing they'd ever seen, a farmer with a hammer in his other hand trying to fight a man with a gun. Their laughter was a sharp, cruel note that cut through the silence of a town that had forgotten what fear felt like. Silas pulled the trigger, but he was so shaky his bullet just kissed the air a few inches from your shoulder, a lover's whisper that missed its mark. You didn't flinch. You didn't even blink. You just kept walking. And that's when their laughter died, replaced with a silence so profound you could hear the beating of your own black heart. Your footfalls were a funeral dirge on the hard-packed earth. You thought of the men who had come to your farm, the way they had laughed as they took everything. Silas wasn't one of them, but in his sneering contempt you saw their faces. He was just a pathetic stand-in, a sacrificial lamb for a fury that needed a home. You advanced, a steady, unstoppable force, and Silas began to backpedal, his face draining of color, his eyes widening with the terror of a mouse that had just met a snake. He was no longer a sneering thief. He was a desperate animal cornered in a cage. He tried to shoot again, but the gun was a confused, clumsy toy in his trembling hands. The hammer in your hand felt like a part of your own arm, a righteous extension of your rage. A single brutal punch to his jaw was all it took. The sound wasn't just a symphony to your ears, it was the feeling of his bones shattering under the force of the fire in your gut, a satisfying final finality. You didn't just beat him down, you tore him apart, an angry bear mauling a salmon. It was ugly, it was brutal, it was over in a heartbeat. The crowd, which had been so eager for a laugh, now stood in a horrified stillness, their faces pale as the desert moon. A whiskey-soaked old man in the back coughed, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "He just mauled him." And just like that, the name stuck. Maul. A word that wasn't a name, but a description. A brand seared into your soul. It wasn't the kind of name you put on a tombstone. It was the kind you put on a wanted poster.
The name Maul became a brand, a heavy inheritance you didn't ask for. It preceded you like a storm cloud, and that suited you just fine. You'd hear it whispered in saloons, the sound of it a furtive hiss behind closed hands as a drunkard shot you a terrified glance. You'd see traders, men who once boasted of their courage, fall silent and avert their eyes when you walked past, their gazes glued to your sledgehammer. Mothers would shush their children with stories of a boogeyman named Maul who'd come for them if they didn't behave. How ironic, you thought, that you, a man who had only ever wanted to build, had become a walking ghost story. You also began to notice things, a different kind of compass that felt less like an ability and more like a disease. When you were near one of them, the kind of man who'd wear a crow tattoo, a cold shiver would run down your spine. The air would go dead still, the laughter would cease, and the world would hold its breath. It was a premonition, a cold, hard certainty that you were close to another piece of the puzzle, another soul who had bought your family for a handful of silver. This wasn't a gift, it was a curse that tethered you to your purpose. You picked up a pistol once, a shiny piece of metal from a man you'd dispatched in a back alley. It felt alien in your hands, too light, too delicate. It was a tool of a civilized man, a weapon for a duel of honor. It was all so polite. You stared at it for a long minute, this elegant machine of death, and then you tossed it into a muddy watering hole. The splash it made was a mockery of the fire that burned in your gut, a last pathetic sigh of a world that no longer fit you. The tools of creation had become the instruments of your destruction. Your hammer, now nicked and scarred, felt like a part of your arm. A shovel, a pickaxe, a piece of lumber with a rusty nail in it. These were your weapons, crude, brutal, and utterly without apology. The rumors about you, once a faint whisper, now rode ahead of you like a galloping horse. People said you were a monster, a half-man, half-bear who didn't feel pain.
Others said you were a ghost, a vengeful spirit who couldn't be killed because you were already dead.
The whispers of your myth were louder than any pistol shot. You rode into a town called Redemption, a place that, ironically, offered none. A sheriff with a face as weathered as old leather sat in an office that smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and silent despair. His desk was piled high with case files, a testament to the burdens he couldn't lift. He looked at you, not with the fear you'd become accustomed to, but with a weary sort of recognition. He saw the hammer, the blood-caked clothes, and the fire in your eyes. He just sighed, a gust of wind that spoke volumes about the futility of his job. "You're trouble," he said, his voice a low rumble, the kind of trouble that leaves no survivors. "But I'll be damned if I'm going to stop you." He understood. He saw you not as a villain, but as a consequence. He knew the kind of men you were hunting were the same men who made his job a slow, agonizing descent into hell. He didn't ask your name because the name Maul was already written all over your face. A name born of chaos and baptized in blood, just like the lines on his own. In a saloon in Dead Man's Hand, you caught a glimpse of yourself in a broken mirror. It was a cracked and splintered reflection, and the man staring back was a stranger. His face was a map of scars and sun-blistered skin, his eyes a pair of burning coals. The man you used to be, the one with the gentle smile and the kind eyes, was gone. The father had become a ghost. The man in the mirror was a demon, a living monument to the vengeance that now defined you. That's what you were now, a walking horror story. You reached up, your hand touching the cold glass, and for a second you almost laughed at the grotesque irony of it all. You had become the very thing you hated, a monster of pure, unadulterated rage, and you were just along for the ride. The hammer handle was no longer a blank slate. It was a testament to your journey, a roadmap of your brutality. The 3 initial marks had been joined by a dozen more, a chaotic constellation of gashes and nicks. The wood was so scarred that it had become a different texture, rough and gnarled, a perfect reflection of the man holding it. You tried to carve another mark, a ritual of remembrance, a way to count the souls you were sending to hell, but your hand wouldn't move. The rage was no longer a rising tide. It was a vast, bottomless ocean. There was no need to count, no need to keep score. The anger was a constant now, a steady hum in your blood that never went away. The carvings were for a man who still had a sliver of hope, a man who believed in a beginning and an end. You were something else, something that existed in a state of perpetual fury.
Justice? That's a fool's errand. You're not here for that vanity. You are the bullet in a loaded gun, and you are aimed directly at the heart of the Wild West. You have no plan, no grand scheme. You only have instinct. Your compass is the cold feeling down your spine. Your map is the rage in your gut, and your only guide is the sound of distant gunfire. Your life is no longer a journey. It is a hunt, a relentless, furious pursuit of a phantom you know you will never truly find, and you are all too happy to get lost in it.
The moment you pushed open the saloon doors, the world fell to a halt. It wasn't a dramatic pistol-whipping kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence you find in a graveyard at midnight, thick and heavy with unspoken fears. The whole place, a dive so filthy it made a pigsty look like a palace, went still as a posed photograph. A few broken bottles lay scattered near the dartboard, like fallen soldiers. The wooden floor, slick with sawdust and grime, seemed to absorb all sound, making your boots scrape with an unnatural loudness. The air hung heavy with the cloying scent of cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and the faint, coppery smell of old blood. Every eye in that room, from the grizzled old man in the corner nursing a glass of rotgut, to the slick young card shark with a full house, swiveled to stare at you. A few tried to pretend they hadn't seen you, their eyes darting back to their cards or their drinks, but the tension in the air was a physical thing, a suffocating blanket. A cowboy in the back, a big fellow with a handlebar mustache, held his breath so hard he looked like a statue, his chest a barrel held tight in a vise. He'd seen the hammer, the blood-caked clothes, and the empty, burning madness in your eyes. He'd heard the whispers. He saw you not as a man, but as a walking fever dream, a bad omen that had just ridden into town. This was the moment, you thought, where someone would inevitably try to be a hero. But no one moved. They were all frozen like flies in amber, caught in the web of your reputation. The silence was a suffocating blanket, and you were the ghost that haunted it. The bar was a perfect mirror of your soul, a broken, dirty place full of ugly truths. You shuffled to the counter, your boots scraping against the sawdust floor, the sound a violation of the tomb-like silence. The woman behind the bar didn't flinch. She was as still as a statue, a monument carved from granite. Her name was Lena, or so the sign said. She had eyes like chipped obsidian, dark and hard, and she just stared straight at you, a stare that felt less like an accusation and more like a simple, unshakable observation. Her face was a map of hard living and bad luck, but there was a quiet, unshakable strength in her posture. A shotgun, a sawed-off beauty, rested just out of sight under the counter, a silent promise of violence waiting to happen. She didn't ask what you wanted. She didn't ask your name. She didn't even ask where you'd come from. She just looked at you, and in that gaze you felt something you hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not comfort, not kindness, but a raw, unsettling recognition. The unspoken truth was that she saw you, not the monster, not the legend, but the broken thing inside, the man buried beneath the layers of rage and dust. She slid a bottle of cheap whiskey across the counter, its liquid amber glowing like a small, pathetic sunrise, a fleeting hope in the dim light. Her movements were precise, economical, like someone who had learned to conserve every ounce of energy in a world that demanded too much. Next to it, she placed a clean white strip of cloth, a fresh bandage, its stark whiteness a stark contrast to the grime of the bar. The silence was a third person in the room, watching, judging, but her gaze cut through it all. It was a silence filled with 1,000 unspoken questions and 1,000 unspoken answers. Yet she spoke none.
A drunkard at the end of the bar, a belligerent lout who smelled like he'd been marinating in cheap booze for a week, didn't get the memo. He started to stand up, a challenge brewing in his beady, bloodshot eyes, his hand reaching for the rusty knife on his belt. He was all bravado and bad decisions, a firefly trying to fight a wildfire. "What's the matter, ugly?" he slurred, his voice a muddy echo in the quiet room. "You got no manners?" Lena moved like a rattlesnake, faster than a thought,
The sawed-off shotgun appeared on the counter with a metallic thud, its twin barrels aimed right between his eyes. The sight of it was a cold slap of reality. The drunkard's bravado evaporated like morning mist, his mouth snapping shut with a click. Lena didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Sit down, Gus," she said, her voice a low, final rasp, "before I make you a permanent part of the floor." Gus, suddenly as sober as a judge, collapsed back onto his stool, his face a perfect canvas of fear and humiliation. The silence returned, this time with a new, sharper edge, a silence that now held the weight of Gus's humiliation. And in that moment, a bizarre, unexpected sensation settled in your chest, a quiet so deep it felt like a tiny, fragile anchor. It wasn't the dull thrum of rage or the sharp sting of pain. It was a brief, gentle hum, like a forgotten lullaby, a whisper from a life you thought was dead. It had nothing to do with fury or vengeance. It was the calm of an eye in the middle of a hurricane, a feeling your own destructive fury had never, ever given you. For a fleeting second, the constant roar in your head quieted, and you felt a strange, unsettling peace, a peace so alien it almost made you flinch. It was a reminder of what you had lost, yes, but also a glimpse of something you thought no longer existed, a moment of stillness, a breath of clean air in a world choked by dust and blood. You sat there, staring into the dark amber of the whiskey, the fire in your gut momentarily subdued. The bar was no longer a place of ugly chaos, but a strange, temporary sanctuary. Lena, without a word, went back to polishing a glass, the slow, rhythmic motion a stark contrast to the coiled tension in the room. This wasn't home, you knew that, but for a few stolen minutes, it was a place where you were allowed to just be, a man, not a monster. The feeling was as fleeting as a ghost, but it was there, a flicker of light in the endless darkness. Lena finally broke the silence, her words like hammer blows, but without the usual malice. "You can't stay here," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "You're bad luck. You're a bad omen that'll bring the law, or worse, to my doorstep." Her words weren't a judgment. They were a simple statement of fact, a truth as undeniable as the dust on the floor. It was a strange echo of your own thoughts. You were no longer a person, but an event, a foreboding shadow.
You nodded. You didn't argue. You didn't fight back. There was no point. Her words were just a reflection of the world you know inhabited. You reached into your pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver belt buckle, its ornate engraving of a snarling wolf worn smooth with time. It felt heavy in your palm, a cold, metallic echo of the man whose throat you'd crushed, the one who had laughed as he took your last horse. It wasn't money. It was a token of your fury, a piece of your new life, a brutal receipt for a debt collected. You slid it across the bar, the metal scraping against the worn wood, a harsh sound in the renewed silence. It came to a rest next to the whiskey and the bandage, a symbol of brutal payment for a moment of quiet. Lena picked up the buckle. She didn't just glance at it. She held it in her hand, her thumb tracing the faded engraving of the wolf, as if trying to decipher a forgotten language. Her face, a mask of weary indifference, softened for the briefest of seconds, a crack in the granite. Her eyes, those hard, chipped stones, held a flicker of something new, something that looked suspiciously like understanding, or perhaps compassion. She saw the rage, the violence, the ugliness, but she also saw the story behind it, the man who had been shattered into 1,000 pieces and was now only held together by fury.
It was a look that felt more like a physical touch than any punch you'd ever taken, a strange, unsettling warmth in the cold wasteland of your soul. You finished the whiskey, the burn of familiar comfort in your throat, and without a word, you turned and walked out the door. The bar was a filthy, miserable place, but it had left something in you. It wasn't hope, a thing you'd long since buried. It was a simple, stark recognition that not everyone was afraid of the darkness you carried, that some people, some broken people like you, could see the human wreckage beneath the monster. You didn't look back. You didn't have to. You knew that what had happened in there, in that brief, tense standoff, had changed you in a way you couldn't have predicted. You had not found a home. You had not found a friend. You had found, for the first time since the fire, a moment of peaceful resignation. You had no plans, no map, only the cold feeling down your spine telling you where to go next. But you knew now, with a quiet certainty, that this story was not just about fire and blood. It was about the brief, quiet moments between the battles, the moments when a monster could almost feel like a man again.
The ambush came out of nowhere, a sudden storm of lead and fury that turned the world sideways. You were riding hard and fast, a dust devil on a mission, when the rocks on either side of the canyon came to life. 4 of them, a pack of rabid dogs, their rifles barking like a chorus of tin wolves. You were a one-man army, a myth on horseback, but even myths can bleed. A bullet clipped your shoulder, a fiery kiss that spun you from the saddle. You hit the ground like a sack of hammers, your body a chorus of protests. Another shot ripped through your leg, a searing brand that made your vision swim. You were a mountain of a man, a walking avalanche, but you were tumbling now, a monument to vengeance falling apart. They thought you were dead. They thought you were just another pile of meat on the trail, a trophy to be sold for a few silver pieces. They crept closer, their boots whispering over the rocks. You could hear their greed, a low, guttural growl that was more animal than man. That's when the bear woke up. You weren't a blind rage anymore. You were a cornered animal, and you were going to take as many of them with you as you could. You grabbed a fistful of dirt, a silent prayer to a God you no longer believed in, and left the darkness take you. The next thing you knew, you were waking up to the smell of 100 different worlds. Sage and cedar, smoke and something you couldn't name, a green, earthy aroma that felt like the heart of the forest. You were lying on a bed of furs in a teepee, the air warm and thick with mystery. A small fire in the center of the lodge danced like a drunken spirit. Across from you, an old man sat, his back ramrod straight, his hands folded in his lap. He was a shaman, a medicine man named Kaskele. He had a face that was a map of ancient wisdom, his skin a road map of every sunset he'd ever seen. His eyes were the real thing, though. They weren't just eyes. They were deep, quiet pools, windows into a different century. They looked at you, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, you felt completely, utterly seen. He saw the rage, the madness, the animal that had been gnawing on your soul for months. He saw the fire and the blood, but he also saw the man you used to be, the ghost that still lived behind your eyes. He didn't ask a single question. He just watched, a silent sentinel in a world of noise. The wound on your shoulder, The one that should have been a screaming agony was now a dull throb. The hold in your leg, a brand of pure pain, was now a faint echo. He hadn't used a needle and thread or any of the fancy medicine you'd seen. He had healed you with something else entirely. He spoke, his voice a low rumble like a distant thunder. "You carry a bear inside you," he said, "a great furious beast that wants to tear the world apart." He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like a simple fact of life, like pointing out that the sky was blue. He told you a story, not of a man, but of a spirit bear, a creature so wild and powerful it could shake the mountains. It wasn't evil, it was just untamed. It was a force of nature, a thing that had its own purpose, its own way of being. He spoke of the bear's strength, its ferocity, but also its loneliness, its solitary journey through a world that couldn't understand it. He told you that every man has a bear inside him, some a small cub, others a roaring monster. Your bear, he said, was the biggest one he had ever seen. You cannot kill the bear, he said, his voice as steady as a river. To kill the bear is to kill yourself. He said it like a man telling you not to try and put out the sun. The bear, he explained, was a part of you, the vengeance, the fury, the instinct to survive, the very reason you had not died on that dusty trail. But the bear was blind. It was running on instinct alone, a hurricane without a direction. You must not kill it, he repeated. You must tame it. He said this not like a wise old man giving advice, but like a skilled horse tamer speaking to a wild stallion. You just sat there, a silent statue carved from a block of confused disbelief. Your mind, the part of you that still thought in terms of bullets and revenge, scoffed at the idea. This was nonsense, ancient hocus-pocus. You were a man of the West, a man of grit and steel, not a man of stories and spirits. But somewhere, deep down in the quiet, bruised core of your soul, a tiny, fragile seed of peace took root. You didn't believe him, not for a second, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, you felt something that wasn't rage. You felt a stillness. You just nodded, a silent admission that your fury was tired of running.
He held out his hand. In his palm was a small leather pouch, a tiny bag that seemed to hum with life. "When the raw starts," he said, his eyes drilling into yours, "when you feel the bear taking over, smell this." He didn't tell you what was inside. You didn't ask. You just took the pouch, the soft leather a strange comfort against your calloused palm. It was a symbol of a different kind of strength, a strength you didn't know you had. You stayed with Casquet for days, days that bled into a single, seamless memory. You learned to be silent. You learned to listen. The world, once a cacophony of your own rage and the sounds of distant gunfire, became a symphony of small, delicate things. The whisper of the wind through the tall grass, the snap of a twig in the fire, the slow, rhythmic beat of your own heart, a drum that had long been forgotten. You weren't a whirlwind of action anymore. You were a quiet observer, a still pond reflecting the chaos around you. It was a strange and unsettling kind of learning, a lesson in letting go of the need to always be moving. You were still a predator, but for the first time, you were a predator who was learning to wait. On the last night, Casquet looked at you, a soft smile on his weathered face. "You think you are looking for death," he said, his voice a low, knowing sound. "You are not. You are looking for life, the life that was taken from you." He said it so simply, so gently, that it hit you like a punch to the gut. All this time you had thought you were a seeker of endings, a reaper of souls, a man on a journey to the grave. But he was right. You weren't looking for death. You were looking for the echo of a life that was gone, a life you were trying to bring back with fire and steel. You weren't a man who wanted to die. You were a man who was desperate to live again, a man who just didn't know how. You left at dawn, the small pouch of herbs a warm weight in your pocket. You didn't thank him. You didn't have to. You just looked him in the eye, a silent conversation passing between two broken men who had found a strange sort of peace together. You were still a storm, still a force of destruction, but you weren't blind anymore. You were a storm with a purpose, a hurricane with a destination. Your compass was no longer just the rage in your gut. It was a quiet, humming certainty that there was something more than just blood on the road ahead. You were still a monster, but you were a monster with a conscience, and that made all the difference.
The sun was a malevolent eye in the sky, a burning torch that turned the dust of Prosperity Gulch into a shimmering golden haze. It beat down on the street, a perfect stage for a duel that everyone knew was coming. He stood on the other side of the empty road, a man carved from myth. His name was Quick-Drawed Jake. He was the kind of man who'd kill you for breathing wrong, the type who would shoot a fly off a saloon door from 50 yards just for sport. People said his hand was faster than a rattlesnake's strike, faster than a thought. The legends whispered of how he had cleared entire towns, leaving a trail of tombstones as his personal monument. He was hired to make you disappear, to turn you into just another ghost story in an unmarked grave. The whole town had emptied out to watch, a silent, hungry beast with 1,000 eyes, perched on rooftops and peeking through dusty curtains. Every man, woman, and child had come to see the unstoppable force meet the immovable object, a bullet meeting a hammer. They were silent, their faces slick with sweat, their eyes wide and unblinking, like vultures waiting for a carcass. You could almost hear the town's collective heartbeat, a frantic drumbeat beneath the suffocating silence. You stood there, a solitary giant in the middle of a perfect stillness. The heavy sledgehammer in your hand felt like a lead anchor, a blunt instrument in a world of fine-tuned precision, a relic from another age. Jake's hand hovered over the polished butt of his six-shooter, a coiled metallic serpent ready to strike, its cold steel glinting in the merciless sun. The air was thick with unspoken tension, so much so that you could almost taste it, a glass box that could shatter at any second with the slightest breath. A fly buzzed lazily by your ear, the only sound for miles, before the world exploded. His hand moved, a blur of motion that defied the laws of time and physics, a feat of pure, trained instinct. He drew. The gun barked once, a sharp, clean sound that tore through the silence like a razor. The bullet, a silver hornet, zipped past your ear, a fiery whisper, and grazed your shoulder,
a reminder that even a legend could draw blood.
The pain wasn't pain, not really. It was a pressure, a sudden, hot reminder that you were still alive, a searing brand on your flesh that felt not like torture, but a strange, wild exhilaration. It was a trigger. The blood, a warm crimson line, snaked its way down your arm, a banner of your own mortality, a stark contrast to the golden dust around you. But it wasn't a warning. It was a switch, flipped deep in the forgotten corners of your soul like the tumblers of a massive safe. The bear woke up. It didn't just stir, it exploded from its slumber, a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered rage that swallowed every other thought, every whisper of doubt. Your vision narrowed to a tunnel, focused only on the man before you. Jake's eyes, a second ago filled with the casual confidence of a hunter watching his prey, now went wide with a look of dawning horror, a realization that hit him harder than any punch. He hadn't shot a man. He had poked a sleeping monster with a spick, kicked a hornet's nest with his bare foot. He had expected you to go down, or at the very least, to flinch, to show a flicker of human weakness. But you didn't flinch. You didn't dodge. You didn't even raise the hammer, a silent testament to the raw, untamed power now surging in your veins. You just started to run, not like a man driven by muscle and bone, but like a freight train, a locomotive of fury barreling down a track of vengeance, unstoppable and unyielding. Your boots pounded the hard-packed earth, each step a drumbeat of a coming disaster shaking the silent town. Jake, the fastest man alive, now looked like a panicked child caught in the headlights of a charging locomotive, his face drained of color. He tried to shoot again. His hand, so elegant and swift a moment ago, now fumbled with the hammer of the gun, a clumsy, confused machine in his trembling fingers. The bullet that erupted from the barrel was a wild, desperate plea, a screaming coward that went wide, chewing up dust a foot from your chest, as useless as a prayer in a firestorm. A bullet can stop a man, but it can't stop a hurricane, a force of pure elemental chaos. It can't stop an avalanche. You were a force of nature, a lawless thing that moved with a terrifying grace, not of speed, but of sheer, unstoppable power. You didn't need to be fast. You just needed to be inevitable. You closed the distance in 3 monstrous strides, a predator closing in on its prey, a long shadow engulfing his shrinking form. Jake, the man who had built his whole life around the six-shooter, who lived and breathed its cold steel, now looked at it like it was a useless broken toy, a relic of a shattered dream. His face was a sheet of white. His legendary confidence evaporated like morning dew, leaving only raw, naked fear. He tried to raise the gun to fire one last time, a desperate, futile gesture, a final gasp of defiance against the inevitable. That's when your hand moved. Not the hand with the hammer, the symbol of your brute strength. The other one, the one that was a tool for building, now a wrecking ball, precise and devastating. You didn't hit him. You didn't even look at him. You hit the gun. Your fist, a rock of hardened flesh and bone, forged over years of labor, and now supercharged by primal fury, smashed down on the elegant machinery, and it crumpled. A sound like 1,000 tiny bones breaking, a shriek of tortured metal echoed in the stunned silence. The gun, a symbol of a man's power and skill, the very essence of his legend, fell to the dirt, a mangled, useless piece of metal, a twisted mockery of its former glory.
Jake, the fastest gun in the West, the man who had never backed down from a fight, collapsed to his knees, his spirit visibly breaking with his weapon. The gun was his identity, his shield, his kingdom. Without it, he was nothing but a scared, whimpering man. He looked up at you, the whites of his eyes screaming, his jaw trembling like a trapped squirrel, his mouth gaping, but no sound coming out. You could see the realization burning in his eyes. He wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting the end of an era, a monster that had crawled out of a grave to tell him that his time was over. He was a legend of a world that was dying, and you were the brutal, ugly truth of the world that was being born, a force too primal for his polished steel. He raised his hands, a gesture of surrender, a white flag raised against the inevitable. The town, the silent, hungry beast, finally let out a gasp, a collective intake of breath that was a mixture of horror and awe, a sound that rippled through the stunned air. They had come to see a duel. They had come to see a man die. They had seen a god fall and a new, terrifying one rise from the dust. The great quick-draw Jake, the man who had made a fortune and a name from his speed, was now a whimpering dog in the dirt, his legend shattered. And you, the man with no name, no gun, and no plan, stood over him like a triumphant statue carved from shadow and fury. You didn't kill him. There was no point. Killing him would have been a kindness, an easy escape from the world you had just handed him, a mercy he didn't deserve. You just stood there for a long, quiet minute, the dust from your charge settling around your boots, the quiet returning to the town like a slow, deliberate fog, heavier than before. You looked down at him for a long, quiet minute, seeing not a legendary gunfighter, but just a man, a scared, broken man, whose entire identity was a six-shooter that was now just a pile of scrap metal, its power utterly meaningless. His reputation, his myth, his entire life, the carefully constructed edifice of his fame, lay in the dirt, a tangled wreck, exposed and pathetic. You just turned and walked away. The town, still in that terrible, suffocating silence, parted like the Red Sea to let you pass, their eyes wide and unblinking, glued to your receding shape. You walked past the terrified faces, the eyes that now saw you not as a hero or a villain, not as a man, but as something else entirely, a force, an inevitability, a walking storm that had just swept through their neatly ordered world. You left behind a legend that had been erased, a story that was now just a footnote in a new, darker book, a brutal chapter written in dust and fear. The sun still burned, a cruel eye in the sky. The dust still swirled in golden eddies, but the world was a different place, forever marked by your passing.
You had won. You had defeated a legendary gunfighter with your bare hands, a feat that would be whispered about in saloons for 100 years, turning into a legend, growing with each retelling. You had proven that speed and skill, the cornerstones of the Wild West, were nothing against a primal, untamed fury, a force too crude for his polished steel. But as you walked out of that town, the sound of your boots the only noise in the world, echoing in the stunned silence, you felt no satisfaction. There was no triumphant roar in your heart, no sense of accomplishment. The fight had been fast, it had been brutal, it had been pointless. You had defeated a man, but the men who had truly wronged you, the architects of your living hell, were still out there, elusive shadows on the horizon. You had proven a point, but the wound in your soul was still there, a hollow, empty ache that no amount of violence could ever fill,
a gnawing hunger at the very core of your being. You were still just a man on a mission, a monster with a conscience, a force of nature trapped between destruction and a desperate yearning for something more. And the path ahead was still long, still full of dust and blood, stretching on into the unknown. But for the first time, you felt a new kind of emptiness, a new kind of quiet, a stark realization that winning was not the same as peace. You had won, but you had not found peace. And that was the cruelest joke of all, a bitter laugh from the universe itself.
The sound hit you first, a terrible, mechanical gnawing that tore at the quiet of the canyon. It was the blasphemous symphony of greed, 100 pickaxes singing a hymn of avarice against the sacred stone, a constant, ugly clamor that felt like a chisel working on your very soul. You could hear the prospectors, a swarm of human locusts, their shouts echoing off the walls, a cacophony of avarice and destruction. They had come, not with respect, but with a thirst for gold that tasted like rust and ruined promises. They had desecrated the land of Cascay's people, turning a place of quiet strength into a circus of madness. The canyon, once a cathedral carved by the river god's own hands, was now a mine pit, an open wound bleeding rock and dust. You could smell the scent of raw, upturned earth mingling with the pungent odor of their sweat and the metallic tang of their greed. Cascay led you there, his face a stone mask of ancient sorrow, his eyes, those deep, quiet pools, holding a pain as vast and timeless as the canyon itself. He didn't say much, just pointed. "They take our ground," he said, his voice a low growl of thunder. "They steal the bones of our mothers." This wasn't about revenge, he told you, and your heart, a tired old dog, perked up its ears. This was about something else entirely. It was about protection. This was a different kind of war, he said, not the kind you wage for yourself, but the kind you fight for something bigger than your own miserable, broken life. And you, a man who had only ever known how to fight for blood, felt a strange, new purpose settle in your chest like a stone in a calm pond, a feeling of being filled rather than emptied. You weren't a battering ram anymore. You weren't a blind avalanche of rage. Cascade taught you to be a shadow, a ghost that moved with the land itself. The canyon wasn't just a place, it was a weapon, and Cascade taught you its language. You learned to move like the coyote, silent and unseen, an invisible wolf among the sheep. You learned to place your feet where the wind wouldn't carry the sound, to breathe when the noise of the picks was loudest, to make your body disappear into the contours of the rock face. The fury was still there, a hot coal in your gut, but now it had a leash. You were the master, not the servant. You climbed high, a human fly on a wall of jagged stone, the cold rock a familiar comfort against your palms, a tangible connection to the earth you were now sworn to defend. Below, the prospectors were a hive of noisy bugs, their greed a palpable humming thing that seemed to vibrate in the very air. You watched them, not with the blind fury of a monster, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a general planning his campaign. You saw the young fool swinging his pick with a laugh, the old man hunched over a sluice box, his face a greedy mask of hope. The foreman yelling orders from his perch. They were a mess of chaos, a herd of wild horses running head first toward a cliff. You saw the weak spots, the lines of communication that were just threads of foolishness waiting to be cut. You saw the massive, unstable rock formation precariously balanced high above their makeshift camp, a monument to the canyon's patience, a sleeping giant ready to fall. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about the cold, satisfying logic of a trap being sprung.
The first move wasn't a roar. It was a whisper. You sent a small cascade of rocks tumbling down, not to kill, but to cause chaos. It was a joke, a prank played on the arrogant invaders, but it was a joke with a punchline that hit them like a fist. The prospectors, a crew of dirty, gold-drunk fools, panicked. They scattered like roaches when the light comes on, their shouts of confusion a sweet melody to your ears. The men of the tribe, Cascaya's warriors, were not a mob. They were a symphony of calculated violence, a deadly ballet of bows and stone-tipped spears. They moved as one, a single flowing river of retribution, a silent, deadly current of purpose. They used the canyon itself, the high ground a natural fortress, their knowledge of the land a second skin. And you, the angry river that had once flowed alone, found yourself part of a greater current. You fought not with your usual blind abandon, but with the focus of a craftsman. You used your hammer not to crush skulls, but to sever ropes, to smash support beams, to turn their own tools against them. A rope ladder, a lifeline for a fool in a hole, was snapped by one swing of your hammer, and the man inside screamed a curse that was swallowed by the canyon's maw. It was a brutal dance, but it was a dance with a purpose. It was a fight to save, not to destroy. You saw the look on the face of one of the tribal warriors, a young man with a fierce, determined gaze, as he looked at your hammer not with fear, but with a silent nod of understanding. The drum started, a deep, resonant beat that came from a distant part of the canyon. It wasn't a call for war. It was a heartbeat, a rhythm of the earth itself. And you felt it in your bones, a steady, ancient pulse that seemed to resonate with the very core of your being. It was a simple, steady pulse, and for the first time in what felt like 100 years, you found yourself moving to a different beat. The bear inside you, the one that wanted to tear the world apart, was still there, still growling, but now it was a war dog on a leash, a beast that obeyed your command. You climbed higher still, reaching the massive rock formation you had spotted. The air was thin, the wind a sharp, cold knife against your face. You looked down at the chaos you had created, the prospectors running in a terrified daze, their greed replaced by a primal need for survival. You saw the men of the tribe below, their faces painted with the ancient symbols of war, their eyes full of a quiet, unshakable resolve. They looked at you, the crazy white man with the hammer, and their gaze was not filled with fear. It was filled with a strange, quiet respect, a nod of a brother to a brother. In that moment, surrounded by men who had every reason to hate you, men whose land you had likely once passed over with the same kind of careless arrogance, you realized something that hit you harder than any bullet. You weren't the only one in the world, the only survivor, the only monster with a ghost in his eyes. You had found a tribe. You had found a family. With the rhythmic beat of the drum now a driving force in your soul, you lifted your hammer, the metal cold and heavy in your hands, but no longer a burden. This wasn't about rage anymore. This was about a purpose, a new kind of power that felt as old as the mountains. You brought the hammer down, not on a man, but on the very rock itself. The first blow was a tremor, a warning rumble. The second was a groan from the earth itself, a sound of protest and pain. The third was a mighty, earth-shaking crack that sounded like the end of the world, a furious, triumphant shout from the canyon itself. The massive rock formation broke loose, a thundering avalanche of stone and dust. It wasn't a killing blow. It was a warning shot from a giant, a furious gesture of the mountain telling them to get out. The landslide tore through their camp, burying their tools, their tents, their pathetic, glittering dreams of gold. They didn't stand a chance. They ran, a panicked, screaming horde, their greed washed away by the sheer, terrifying force of a mountain's anger. You watched them go, a flood of humanity fleeing a force of nature, their faces twisted not with pain, but with the cold, stark terror of knowing their insignificant lives and dreams were meaningless in the face of a true, ancient power. It was a massacre of their dreams, a burial of their avarice, but it was not a slaughter. No one died. No one was harmed beyond the pride and the fear of 1,000 men who had just found out that their tiny, petty violence was nothing compared to the fury of a land that was alive. You didn't carve a notch on your hammer. You didn't need to. The hammer was no longer just a tool for taking a life. It was a tool for saving one. You had used your anger, the terrible, magnificent beast inside you, not to destroy, but to protect. And in doing so, the beast had changed. It was no longer a blind, hungry thing. It was a watchman, a guardian. The men of the tribe met you at the base of the canyon. They didn't cheer, they didn't clap. They just nodded, their faces grim, but their eyes filled with a new light, a silent acknowledgement of the new man who had fought alongside them. Cascade looked at you, a hint of a smile on his weathered face. He said, "The bear listens to the drum," his voice as soft as the wind. And you knew he was right. The drum wasn't just a sound. It was a call to arms. It was a heartbeat. It was a song of a people. And now, it was a part of your own rhythm. The constant ringing in your head, the ghost of the fire and the blood, was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, steady beat, a new kind of music. You were a storm, a force of destruction, but you were no longer blind. You were a storm with a purpose, a guardian with a rhythm, and you were not alone.
The tip came from a grimy prospector in a saloon that smelled like stale beer, spilled sawdust, and the lingering odor of 1,000 broken dreams. A place where hopes went to die and only the strong survived. He was nursing a shot of whiskey, his eyes darting around the room like a frightened animal, a rat in a cage of his own making, constantly checking over his shoulder as if pursued by a relentless shadow. He'd seen your face on a wanted poster, seen the fear in it, and he saw something else, a flicker of shared darkness, a kindred spirit in the shadows. He leaned in, his voice a gravelly whisper, thick with the dust of 1,000 trails and the fear of 1,000 nights. "I saw one of them, the men you're looking for. Got a crow tattooed on his shoulder, a black bird of death, a mark of the devil himself. He's on the westbound locomotive, leaving at sundown, heading straight for the sunset, like a coward fleeing his own shadow.
It was a whisper that hit you like a cannonball, not just in the gut, but in the very core of your being, a physical jolt of pure adrenaline. The world, which had been a slow, deliberate march, suddenly accelerated into a blur of motion, every sound sharpening, every color intensifying. The clock on the wall, a grinning idiot of a timepiece, seemed to mock you, its hands a blur, counting down the seconds to your vengeance. This wasn't a legend, this was a fact. A living, breathing piece of your past, a fragment of the hell that had swallowed your life, was sitting on a train just a few miles away, a tangible piece of the nightmare you carried. The old rage, the familiar fire started to burn again, but this time it felt different. It was a controlled blaze, a smithy's forge, not a mindless forest fire. It was a focused heat, a weapon being honed, not a blind eruption. The hunt was on, and you, the hunter, had a name, a location, and a target, a promise of a reckoning that was long overdue. The crow, a scavenger of the dead, had found a roost, and you, the rightful owner of the grave, were coming to claim it.
You didn't have a ticket. A ticket was for a man with a destination, a man with a future, a man who believed in rules. You are a man with a purpose, a past, and a very short timeline. The train, a roaring iron beast, a behemoth of steel and steam, was a symbol of a world that was leaving you behind. A steel snake slithering away into the sunset, carrying your vengeance with it. Its great piston rods pumped like the legs of an enraged mechanical spider, and the smell of hot oil and coal smoke was a pungent perfume of progress and power. You ran alongside it, your boots pounding the hard earth, a blur of motion against the static desert, a predator chasing a machine, a ghost haunting a piece of progress. With a leap that defied common sense and good judgment, a leap born of desperation and primal fury, you grabbed onto a metal rung on the last car, your body a whip of pure instinct, muscles screaming in protest, and scrambled onto the roof, the metal hot beneath your hands. The wind, a screaming ghost, tried to tear you from your perch, a relentless hand trying to push you back into the dust. The smoke from the engine, a dark, choking cloud, burned your eyes and lungs, tasting of ash and the promise of retribution. The world below was a rushing river of blurred colors and indistinct shapes, a chaotic tapestry of a life you no longer belonged to. You were on top of the world, on top of the chase, a human gargoyle clinging to the spine of a metal monster, your silhouette stark against the fading light. You moved along the top of the train, a silent panther on a long rattling chain, each step a calculated risk, a desperate, dangerous gamble against the speed and unforgiving nature of the steel beast. The constant swaying and groaning of the cars beneath you was a chaotic lullaby, a rhythm of destruction, but you moved with a strange, unnatural grace, your focus absolute, your purpose a cold, hard stone in your gut, guiding you forward through the roaring wind. You had no safety net, no second chance. You were an act of pure, unadulterated will, a force of nature riding a manufactured storm.
Inside, the world was a different kind of chaos, a microcosm of the hell you carried. You heard the sounds before you saw them, the shouts of men, the pop, pop, pop of gunfire echoing off the metal walls like a manic drum solo, the frantic, high-pitched screams of the passengers, a symphony of terror. A robbery, you thought, a classic train heist, a dime novel plot come to life, a small-time storm of violence that was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the one you were about to unleash. You were a tornado about to enter a wind tunnel, a force of nature about to collide with a petty squabble. You dropped down from the roof into the last car, the sudden heavy clatter of your boots on the wood floor a jarring final note in the gunfight symphony, silencing the chaos for a split second. Heads snapped towards you. Guns that had been aimed at the cowering robbers now swiveled, slowly, to face you, their barrels like hungry eyes. The robbers, a couple of wild-eyed amateurs, their faces streaked with sweat and fear, looked at you like you were a fresh nightmare that had just stepped off the roof, a ghost come to collect. You weren't a robber. You weren't an agent. You were the main event, the chaos that made their little gunfight look like a children's game, a mere prelude to the real show. You moved, not with the fluid grace of a gunfighter, but with the brutal, efficient power of a blacksmith's hammer, each movement a testament to raw, untamed strength. You knocked a table over, its contents, cards, bottles, scattered coins, flying like a panicked flock of birds, a whirlwind of destruction. A chair became a projectile, sent spinning into a window with a crash. A robber was sent careening into a wall with a single, vicious shove, his body a rag doll, his gun clattering uselessly to the floor. You ripped a rifle from another man's hands, its wooden stock splintering under your grip, and used it to sweep a third man off his feet. They were all just obstacles, just pieces of furniture in your way, insignificant specks in the path of your vengeance. The passengers, once screaming, now watched in a stunned silence, their fear of the robbers replaced by a much older, deeper terror.
You moved through the train like a hurricane on rails, a force of nature that broke everything in its path, leaving a trail of shattered wood, terrified whispers, and broken men. You tore through the cars, a one-man demolition crew. The frantic shouts of the passengers and the wild gunfire, a chaotic, desperate soundtrack to your single-minded purpose. The scent of him, the scent of the crow, was getting stronger, a familiar stench of fear and rot that was a compass in your hunt, a beacon guiding you through the storm. You finally found him in the engine car, a place of noise and heat and pistons pumping like a giant metal heart, a mechanical beast roaring its own song of power. He was huddled in the corner, a pathetic, quivering mass of a man, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his lips trembling like a leaf in a storm. His name was Silas, a name as insignificant as his life. The crow tattoo on his shoulder, the mark of a killer, the symbol of his part in your hell, now looked ridiculous on this scared little man, a mockery of the darkness it was supposed to represent. He didn't have a rifle, he didn't have a knife. He had a 6-shooter, a fine piece of machinery, but it was shaking in his hand like a terrified rat, its cold steel useless against the raw, primal fear that consumed him. He wasn't a legend, he wasn't a myth. He was a coward, a worm trying to hide from the boot that was about to crush him, a pathetic footnote in a story he thought he had written. He was a man who had been part of a mob, a piece of a larger monster, and now he was a solitary mouse in the shadow of a hawk, utterly alone with his fear. His eyes met yours, and you saw no challenge, no hatred, no anger. You saw only the desperate plea of a man who knew he was about to die, a pure, unadulterated terror that was a mirror of your own suffering. You didn't give him a chance. There was no movie monologue, no long, drawn-out speech about revenge. There was only the primal, animalistic certainty of a wolf that has finally cornered its prey.
He raised his gun, a desperate, futile gesture, a last gasp of defiance. But his hand was a blur of fear, not speed. He couldn't aim, he couldn't shoot. He was a statue of terror, frozen in a moment of pure, unadulterated fear. You didn't even use the hammer. You didn't need to. You just moved. Your fist, a rock of hardened bone and muscle, smashed into his face with the force of a falling stone. It was a single, definitive blow, a sentence passed and delivered in the same instant. He fell like a puppet with its strings cut, his body a discarded toy on the dirty floor of the train, his head striking the metal with a sickening thud. He was a rat in your trap, and the trap had just sprung shut. The satisfaction wasn't a loud cheer. It was a cold, hard, quiet stone in your gut, a grim, brutal finality that was a poor substitute for peace. He was a piece of the puzzle, and you had just found where he fit. The crow, the symbol of his part in the destruction of your life, was now just a badge of his own pathetic end, a brand of his failure, a tattoo on a dead man. The weight of his crime, a fraction of the total, was now settled, and you, the weary accountant of this bloody ledger, had balanced one more account.
The train, a roaring beast that had been your chariot of vengeance, suddenly screeched to a halt with a terrible, ear-splitting shriek of tortured metal and sparks that rained down like hellfire. The locomotive, pushed to its limits by the chaos in the cab, had derailed, a spectacular, violent ballet of iron and steam. The world tilted sideways, a chaotic, violent lurch that threw you against the wall, a puppet in a sudden, violent play, but you were unhurt. The world was a jumbled mess of twisted metal, shattered glass, spilled luggage, and screaming people, a scene of carnage that looked eerily familiar. You stumbled out of the wreckage, a silent ghost in the aftermath of a terrible storm, the dust and steam swirling around you like a shroud. And there, in the midst of the chaos, was Cascaye. He was a figure of calm in a world of madness, his face a silent, compassionate mask, his hands already helping the injured, his voice a quiet command in the noise. He wasn't there for the vengeance. He was there to help the injured, to offer a steady hand in a world that had gone sideways. He had followed you, not to condone your violence, but to witness your purpose, to see the man who was both a storm and a steady hand. He saw you, a man who had just destroyed a man, and he nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the new path you were on, a path that was still full of blood, but was no longer blind. You had completed a part of your mission. You had found one of the men. You had punished him. But there was no glory. There was no celebration. The feeling was not one of triumph, but of grim, cold, brutal finality. The ringing in your ears, the ghost of the fire and the blood was not gone, but it was quieter now, a dull hum instead of a scream, a steady, rhythmic beat. You had proved that you were a powerful force, a devastating hunter, a monster with a purpose. But the power you felt was not the chaotic, blind rage of the past. It was the focused, controlled power of a man who had a list and who was crossing off the names one by one. You were no longer just a man looking for a fight. You were a man looking for a conclusion, a man with a terrible, beautiful, bloody purpose, a man who was both judge and jury. The journey wasn't over.
not by a long shot. The train was a wreck, your path forward was blocked, and there were more names on your list, more ghosts to hunt down. But you were no longer alone, and you were no longer blind, and that, you knew, was all that mattered. The cold stone in your gut was a reminder of the task ahead, a heavy, constant weight that would not be lifted until the last crow had fallen. You had taken a step, a massive, bloody step, on the road to your own kind of peace, but it was a road that was paved with destruction, and the journey had only just begun.
They figured it out. Of course they did. Vengeance is a simple beast, but friendship is a complicated animal. A beast with a soft underbelly and a big, beating heart. They saw you with Cascaye, saw the way he looked at you, not with fear, but with the quiet respect of a man who saw a kindred soul, a fellow traveler on a long, dusty road. They saw the calm that had started to settle in your eyes, the fury that had a purpose. They saw that you weren't just a storm anymore. You were a storm with a rudder. And so, they came for the rudder. A rider, pale as a ghost and twice as fast, came tearing into the camp, a whirlwind of desperation and fear. "They're at the bluff," he gasped, his voice a broken reed in the wind. "The men from the train, they got Cascaye. They want you." It was a whisper that hit you like a shovel to the face. The world, which had just started to make some semblance of sense, suddenly tilted on its axis, a carousel of calm spinning into a maelstrom of madness. The rhythm you had found, the beat of the drum, was suddenly a frantic panic tattoo in your chest. The bear inside you didn't just wake up, it exploded from its cage, a furious lion on a short chain, ready to tear the world apart. You grabbed your hammer, its cold steel a familiar, grim comfort, and you ran. You ran not as a man, but as a force of nature, a thunderbolt with a purpose, a juggernaut with a very personal bone to pick. The wind screamed in your ears, but it wasn't the wind. It was the frantic roar of your own desperation, the sound of a man trying to outrun fate itself. You arrived at the bluff, a desolate place where the wind howled a lonely song, and you were too late. The fight was over. It wasn't a fight, really. It was a slaughter. A bunch of two-bit thugs and broken-down men, the kind of greasy-faced lowlifes to scrape the bottom of the world's barrel, had ganged up on a man whose soul was older than the mountains. He was on his knees, his hands tied, a crimson stain spreading across the front of his buckskin shirt like a rose in the desert, a beautiful, tragic splash of color in a world of gray. The men who had done this, a group of 5 or 6, looked up at you with the terrified bravado of cornered animals. They expected you to be a man, and they were ready for a fight. They didn't know they had just summoned a hurricane, a force of vengeance that had a very personal grudge against them. One of them, a lanky, sallow-faced idiot with a gun in his hand, took a step forward. He opened his mouth, probably to say something clever or threatening, but you didn't give him the chance. Your hammer, a blur of motion, met his face with a sound like a melon being dropped from a great height. He was a piece of cheap furniture, and you were a demolition crew. The others scattered like a flock of terrified sparrows. You didn't chase them. You didn't need to. They were already dead men walking. Your world, for a brief, terrible moment, was just Cascaye.
You knelt beside him, the cold, hard ground a bitter pillow for his head. He looked at you, his eyes, those deep, quiet pools, now clouded with the pain that was as old as the world itself, a pain you knew all too well. They took your peace, he whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound, a leaf rustling in the wind. But the drum still beats for you. His words were a physical thing, a balm on your wounded soul, a promise in the middle of a shattered world. He reached up, his hand a gnarled branch of an old oak tree, a hand that had known the feel of stone and sun, met your face, his touch a final gentle blessing. Your anger, he said, his voice now a single steady note, is not for revenge, but for protection. He was telling you, in his last breath, that the monster inside you, the wild, untamed beast, could be a guardian, a watcher on the wall. He was telling you that you were a shield, not a sword. His eyes, those deep, quiet pools, looked past you, up at the sky, and then they went out, just like that. A flame snuffed out by the cruel hand of fate. Kuskai, the man who had taught you the language of the rocks and the rhythm of the drum, the man who had given you a purpose, died in your arms. And you, the man who had been a killer, a monster, and a god, were reduced to a child, holding the body of the only father you had ever known. His death was not a victory for them. It was a defeat for you. Everything went black. The world, the sun, the sky, the dirt, it all became a single solid color of furious, unending darkness. The rage that had been a leash on a war dog suddenly became a runaway train, a force of chaos and destruction that knew no bounds. You were a lost soul, a ship without a compass, a ghost that wandered the earth, and you were angry. You were so angry you could taste it, a bitter metallic flavor on your tongue that was a mix of blood and regret. You hunted them down, the men who had done this, a relentless, single-minded machine of vengeance. They thought they had escaped, scattered like seeds in the wind, but they had forgotten that a storm always follows a gust of wind. You were the storm. One of them was found in a ditch, his neck broken, his body a twisted mess of limbs and terror. Another was found in a saloon, his head caved in, his face a grotesque mask of surprise. The third one, the lanky idiot from the bluff, was found 100 miles from anywhere, his body nothing but a series of broken, shattered bones, his death a quiet, miserable footnote in a story that was a symphony of violence. There was no joy in this, no triumph, no satisfaction. This wasn't about justice. This was about an empty, hollow need, a frantic attempt to fill a hole in your soul with the blood of other men. This wasn't a mission. It was a descent. You came back to town, a walking corpse, a ghost haunting the streets of the living. You didn't go to the canyon. You didn't go to the tribe. You went to Lena's bar, a place that had once been a refuge, a haven from the storm. You walked in, a silent, grim-faced monument to loss, your clothes torn, your face streaked with dirt and blood that wasn't yours. You didn't say a word. You didn't need to. The story was written on your face, in the deadness of your eyes, in the hammer that felt as if it had become a permanent part of your arm. Lena, a woman who had seen it all, a woman who had seen men break and men die, looked at you with a fear that was not for herself, but for you. It was the look of a mother watching her son get lost in the darkness, the look of a friend seeing a light go out. She didn't ask what happened. She just poured a glass of whiskey, a small amber prayer, and slid it across the bar. You drank it, a burning river of oblivion, and then another and another. The whiskey was a fire, but it couldn't burn away the cold, hard stone in your gut. You just sat there, a silent statue of sorrow, a monument to a grief that had no words. You went to the funeral, not for yourself, but for him. You stood on a hill overlooking the canyon, the sacred place where you had learned to listen to the drum, the place where you had found your purpose. Below, the men and women of Kuskei's tribe were gathered, their faces painted with the ancient symbols of sorrow, their voices a low, mournful chant that was a song of a life well lived and a loss deeply felt. They were a family, and you, the man on the hill, were a stranger again, an outsider looking in on a world that was no longer yours. They were burying a warrior, a father, a leader. They were burying the man who had brought you back from the brink, the man who had seen the humanity in the monster. You just stood there, a statue carved from rock and grief, a figure of a man who had forgotten to cry. The tears were there, a river of pain locked deep in your soul, but they couldn't find a way out. They were trapped behind a wall of granite and sorrow, a wall you had built around yourself, brick by bloody brick, to keep the world from getting in. You were a vessel of grief, a silent, empty shell, and the world was an ocean of sound and color you couldn't hear or see.
You didn't carve a notch on your hammer. It felt like a betrayal, a desecration of the memory of a man who had taught you that a hammer was not just a tool for taking a life, but a tool for saving one. Your rage was not a victory, it was an emptiness, a hollow void where your purpose used to be. The killings, the vengeance, the bloody trail you left behind, it was all just a frantic attempt to fill a hole that was getting bigger, not smaller. You had been a man on a mission. Now you were just a man on a bender, a walking, breathing monument to a loss that had no end. The world had gone back to how it was. The sun still burned, the dust still swirled, the men were still greedy, the women were still scared. But now the silence was louder, the loneliness was colder, the anger was sharper, a knife that cut not just others, but you as well, a wound that never healed. You sat there, utterly alone, in a place where the dirt was black with blood, among the broken bodies of men who had dared to touch the one thing that had given you hope. And in the quiet of that terrible final moment, you realized the truth. This loss, the loss of Kuskei, the loss of your friend, your guide, your purpose, hurt more than the first tragedy. The first time,
you lost a family. This time, you lost the hope of finding a new one. And that, you knew, was a far more terrible, far more permanent kind of death.
You came back to Lena's bar, not for the whiskey, not for the numbing fire that promised to erase the world, but for the silence. The world was a screaming, chaotic mess of memories and blood. But in this dimly lit den of broken people and forgotten promises, there was a kind of quiet that you couldn't find anywhere else. The hammer felt like a 10-ton anchor on your hip, a constant, physical reminder of the man you were, the beast you had become. You sat at your usual spot at the corner of the bar, a silent, grim-faced statue of sorrow, your eyes like two holes burned in a blanket. Lena didn't say a word. She just came around the bar, a wisp of a woman with eyes that held the weight of 100 storms, and set a bowl of water and a clean folded cloth in front of you. It was an offering, a small, quiet act of grace that spoke louder than any sermon. She wasn't offering you a drink. She was offering you a way to wash the blood from your hands, a way to clean the dirt from your soul. It was as if she had been waiting for you, waiting for the storm to come back home to its eye. She knew. She always knew. The air between you two was thick with unsaid words, a silent language of grief that you both spoke fluently. The bar, which was usually a raucous, boisterous carnival of life, was now a tomb, a quiet testament to the fact that some wounds could not be healed with a song and a dance. She finally spoke, her voice a low, steady current in the roaring river of your internal chaos. "You can stay," she said, her hands busy polishing a glass that was already clean. "This is a place for lost souls, but you can't stay as this man." Her words were a hammer blow, not to your physical appearance. She was talking about the monster inside you, the wild, untamed beast that had been your only companion for so long. She was giving you a choice, a stark, brutal crossroads on a path you thought had no detours. Stay and be a man, or leave and be a ghost. It was a choice that you had never considered, a concept as foreign to you as the idea of a gentle sunrise. You had only ever known how to be the man with the hammer, the vengeful spirit, the avenging angel of a dead family. But she was offering you a different path, a different kind of life, a different kind of war. And then she told her story. It wasn't a sob story, not a tale of a damsel in distress. It was the story of a warrior, a woman who had fought her own demons, her own wild-eyed phantoms. She spoke of her family, lost to a smallpox epidemic, a silent, invisible enemy that had stolen them away one by one, leaving her to be the sole soldier on a battlefield of memories. She spoke of the man who had wronged her, the man who had stolen her inheritance, her last connection to a life that was gone forever. She told you about the rage, the bitter, coiling hatred that had kept her going for so long, a poison she had sipped from every day. She, too, had been a woman with a hammer, a woman with a list.
And then she told you how she had put it down, how she had traded the hammer for a bar, the vengeance for a business, the hatred for a kind of quiet, grim perseverance. She wasn't a saint. She was just a woman who had chosen to build something in a world that had tried to tear her down. She looked at you, her eyes like two lanterns in the gloom, and you saw it. You saw the same pain, the same loss, the same quiet, unrelenting strength that you carried in your own chest. You weren't a lonely beast anymore. You were just a man, and she was just a woman, two broken pieces of a shattered world trying to find a way to fit together. You realized that you had been fighting a war of your own making, a war you had no chance of winning because the enemy was already inside you. But she, this small, quiet woman with the iron will, was offering you a truce. She was offering you a way out. She was offering you a different kind of battle, a battle to save yourself instead of a battle to destroy others. The silence that had once been a heavy, suffocating blanket was now a soft, warm thing, a space where two souls could finally rest, two ships in the same harbor, anchored in the same sea of sorrow. The quiet of the bar was shattered by the arrival of a man who was all hat and no cattle, a walking, breathing monument to his own arrogance. He was a cowboy, but not the kind you saw in legends. He was the kind you saw in a back alley, the kind that was all cheap swagger and expensive cologne. He stomped into the bar, his boots making a racket on the wood floor, a drunk, grinning idiot looking for a fight. He saw Lena, a woman who looked like a porcelain doll in a world of monsters, and he saw an easy target. "Hey, pretty lady," he slurred, his voice a broken glass. "How about you pour me a shot and a smile?" Lena didn't even look up. She just kept polishing her glass, her face a mask of stone. The cowboy, his pride a wounded animal, slammed his hand on the bar, sending a bottle of rye skittering to the edge. The bar, which had been a quiet haven, was now a powder keg, and he was the match. You, the man who had spent the last year of his life killing men for far less, didn't feel the familiar rush of blood, the hot, furious fire that used to consume you. You just felt a calm, cold certainty, a quiet strength that was a new kind of power. This wasn't a personal attack. This was just a cockroach in fine china shop.
You stood up, a slow, deliberate motion that made the air in the bar feel heavy. The cowboy, the arrogant fool, turned to face you, his grin a smear of drunken stupidity. "What's your problem, old-timer?" he sneered, his hand hovering over the pistol on his hip. He was a small man trying to look big, a tiny shadow trying to block out the sun. He was a flicker of a candle in a hurricane. You didn't answer him. You didn't need to. Your presence was the only answer he was ever going to get. You just walked towards him, your steps a steady, relentless rhythm that seemed to echo in the sudden, terrified silence of the bar. The cowboy, his bravado a flimsy mask, saw it in your eyes. He saw the cold, controlled power, the lack of rage, the quiet, terrifying certainty that he was about to get hurt. He drew his gun, a desperate, final gesture, but it was too late. Your hand, a blur of motion, wasn't aimed at his heart or his head or his gun. It was aimed at his wrist. There was a sharp crack, the sound of a small twig snapping, and the gun, a useless piece of steel, fell to the floor. The cowboy screamed a high-pitched wail of agony and fell to his knees, his face a sudden terrified mask of pain. This wasn't a fight. This was a lesson. You looked down at him, a broken man on the floor, and you just shook your head. He wasn't worth the rage. He wasn't worth the blood. Lena looked at you,
her eyes a mirror of a new, strange kind of hope. She saw the change. She saw the man who had walked in a ghost, but had just acted like a human being. She saw the monster who had put down his hammer, not because he was afraid, but because he was something more. She saw the flicker of a soul in the deadness of your eyes, the first spark of a fire that had been buried for so long. She came around the bar, her steps a quiet drumbeat, and she stood in front of you. The bar was silent. The cowboy was gone, dragged out by a few shaken patrons. It was just you and her, two survivors standing on a lonely patch of ground, a silent understanding passing between you. She reached up and touched your cheek, her hand a warm, gentle thing against your hardened skin. "Go," she said, her voice as soft as a whisper, but with the strength of 100 mountains. "Go and do what you have to do. I will be here. I will be waiting." It was a promise, not just a suggestion. It was a promise of a home, a promise of a future, a promise of a life that wasn't just about the past. She wasn't telling you to forget. She was telling you to finish, to go and settle the debts, to end the story, so you could finally come back and start a new one. You didn't answer her. There was nothing to say. You just stood there, a man who had been given a new purpose, a new kind of war to fight. You looked at the door, at the world outside, a world that was still filled with darkness and death. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the darkness didn't feel so permanent. The ghosts didn't feel so loud. You gave her a single silent nod, a promise as good as any contract written in blood, and you turned and walked out the door. You left her, but you weren't leaving her behind. You were going out to fight the final battle, the battle that would finally earn you the right to come back home. You walked down the street, your boots making a quiet, purposeful sound on the dusty road, the cold, hard weight of your hammer on your hip now feeling less like an anchor and more like a tool. You were still the man with the hammer, the hunter, the storm, but you were a man with a home to come back to. You were fighting for a life, not a death. The greatest gift Lena had given you wasn't a place to stay. It was a reason to come back. And that, you knew, was a far more powerful weapon than any hammer could ever be. You were a man on a journey, but for the first time, you knew the way home. You found him in a ghost town, a place where the wind whistled through empty saloons and the only inhabitants were the ghosts of men who'd lost everything. The town was a tomb of shattered dreams, a monument to the fleeting nature of greed. Its name was Redemption, a bitter joke written in the dust. Viper Silas, the man you had been chasing for what felt like 100 years, the architect of your misery, was there. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. This wasn't a legend, not a dramatic shootout in the middle of a sun-drenched street. This was a funeral, and you were the last mourner. The town was a snake pit, a clever trap set by a man who moved like a viper, all quiet malice and coiled readiness. Every shadow was a lie, every abandoned building a potential assassin. You felt the familiar coil of dread in your gut, but it wasn't the old crippling fear. It was the keen-edged awareness of a predator entering a new hunting ground, a wolf walking into a den of snakes. You walked into that town not as a man looking for a fight, but as a man looking for a conclusion, a final, quiet end to a very long, very bloody story. The air was thick with the dust of 1,000 lives, and the silence was a scream that only you could hear. This was it, the final act, the final dance. The town, a silent stage for a final act of vengeance, was a living, breathing trap. The wind, a mournful ghost, rattled the loose shutters on the windows and moaned through the cracks and the walls, a chorus of forgotten souls. Viper Silas was a student of the craft, a master of misdirection. He had booby-trapped the entire town like a child playing with firecrackers, and every step was a gamble, a roll of the dice in a game that you couldn't afford to lose. You walked with the slow, deliberate care of a bomb technician, your eyes scanning the ground for tripwires, your ears tuned to the slightest creak of a floorboard, the slightest whisper of a loosened stone. The whole town was a lie, a beautiful, sun-drenched piece of deceit, and Viper Silas was the grinning puppet master, pulling the strings. You remembered Cascae, his face a quiet, compassionate mask, his voice a low, steady rumble of thunder. Your anger, he had told you, his voice as soft as the wind, is not for revenge, but for protection. His words were a cool hand on the hot furnace of your rage. You were a storm, but now you were a storm with a purpose, a focused, controlled force of nature. You used your anger not as a blind fury, but as a compass, a keen sense that told you where the traps were hidden, where the shadows were lying in wait. Your anger, that hot, burning core of your being, was now a tool of preservation, a shield against the final desperate lies of a man who had nothing left to lose.
The fight, when it finally came, wasn't a glorious duel. It was a brutal, ugly, desperate brawl in the dirt, a testament to the fact that legends were made for books, and reality was a much messier, much bloodier affair. Viper Silas wasn't a movie villain. He was a small, wiry man with a face like a dried-out prune and eyes like 2 pieces of chipped glass. He fought like a cornered animal, all wild, panicked desperation, his movements a blur of unhinged violence. He had a knife, a beautiful, polished blade that he used like an artist painting a canvas with your blood. He cut you. He cut you bad. The world became a smear of pain and motion, a symphony of cuts and bruises, and the smell of your own blood, a rich, coppery perfume filled the air. But you didn't fall. You were a tree with roots that went down to the very core of the earth, and he was just a man with a sharp knife and a whole lot of anger. You weren't fighting for revenge anymore. You were fighting to survive, fighting for the right to go back, fighting to keep the promise you had made to a ghost in a canyon and a woman in a bar. Your hammer, that familiar, cold anchor, was no longer a weapon of destruction. It was a tool of defense, a shield against the desperate violence of a man who had forgotten what it was to be human. You didn't swing it to break bones. You swung it to block, to deflect, to keep yourself alive. The fight was a dance of attrition, a slow, painful grind that tested every sinew in your body and every ounce of will in your soul. He was a mosquito, a constant, irritating pest, but he was a mosquito with a very sharp sting. You had a cut on your arm that ran from your shoulder to your elbow, a jagged, bloody line that felt like a river of fire. Another on your leg that made every step a painful, deliberate effort. But you didn't fall. You had fallen enough. You were a statue of defiance, a monument to the idea that some things were worth getting cut for, some things were worth getting hurt for. And in the middle of that swirling, bloody maelstrom, you saw it. You saw the opening. He lunged at you, a desperate, final, furious lunge, his knife aimed at your heart, his face a mask of pure hatred. You didn't block it. You didn't deflect it. You let it come close, so close you could feel the cold kiss of the steel on your skin. And then, with a movement that was as old as the desert itself, you reached out and grabbed his hand. The surprise on his face was a priceless thing, a moment of pure, unadulterated shock. He didn't know you were capable of such a quiet, deadly grace. He didn't know you had learned a new kind of power. And with a single, sharp twist of your wrist, there was a terrible, sickening crack, and the knife, his lifeline, his weapon, his only reason for being, fell to the ground. The fight was over. He was a toothless snake, and you were the man who had just taken his fangs.
You looked at him, not with the furious, burning hatred that had once consumed you, but with a cold, quiet sense of finality. He was on his knees, a broken, whimpering man, his face a crumpled, terrified mess. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a legend. He was just a pathetic, scared little man who had gotten in over his head, a victim of his own avarice. You looked into his eyes, those pieces of chipped glass, and you saw it. He didn't see a monster. He didn't see a vengeful ghost, a wild, untamed beast, a demon in the desert. He saw a man. He saw the man who had been broken, the man who had been lost, the man who had come all this way not to destroy him, but to end the nightmare. And in that moment, the anger, that familiar hot coal that had been burning in your gut for so long, finally went out. It didn't go out with a bang. It went out with a sigh, a slow, tired exhalation of a man who had finally finished a very long, very hard day's work. You were a man without a war. You were just a man, tired and sore and bloody and whole. The silence of the ghost town, which had once been a scream, was now a quiet, gentle hum, a kind of peaceful, profound emptiness that was more fulfilling than any victory you had ever known. You looked at your hammer, its cold steel a familiar comfort in your hands. It was covered in dust and blood, a physical record of the journey you had been on. You looked at the notches, the angry, jagged marks that were a testament to the lives you had taken, the ghosts you had avenged. The notches were a history of your suffering, a timeline of your pain. You looked at the hammer not as a weapon, but as a book, a story of a man who had been lost and found again. You took the hammer, and with a slow, deliberate motion, you carved one last notch into its handle, a mark that was different from all the others. This one wasn't for death. It was for life. It was a notch for Caskai, for the man who had taught you the language of the drum and the purpose of the storm. It was a notch for Lena, for the woman who had given you a reason to come back. It was a notch for the man you used to be.
and for the man you were now.
It was a notch for a new beginning, a testament to the idea that you had to go through the fire to come out on the other side, and that the scars you earned were the proof that you had survived. You left him there, a broken, terrified man in a town of ghosts. You didn't kill him. You didn't need to. You had taken his fangs, his venom, his reason for being. He would live a life of fear, a life without purpose, a life that was a far more terrible punishment than any death you could have given him. You walked out of the ghost town, a man who was no longer a ghost himself, a man who was tired and sore and bloody, and finally, whole. You walked back, not as a desperate hunter, but as a man with a destination. You walked back to Lena. The journey was long, the wounds were deep, and the road was dusty, but you walked with a lightness in your step, a rhythm in your soul that was no longer a frantic, panicked tattoo, but a steady, calm drumbeat. You walked towards the sunrise, a great golden eye opening on the world, a promise of a new day, a new beginning, a new kind of life. The past was not forgotten. The ghosts were still there. But now you were looking forward. You were going home. You were walking towards the dawn. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you found these stories meaningful and inspiring, please consider giving us a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support is our greatest motivation to keep going. And don't hesitate to leave a comment telling us where and at what time you're listening from.